Hello everyone, today we talk about the Iberian armies organizations, including the Celtiberian ones. I'm just using the geographical adjective to include all of these groups. It's not our first video about Iberian warfare. In fact, I already made one on Iberian tactics specifically, which essentially mirrors a bit this one as far as at least as the chronology. And of course all the various insight that you can draw from, say, tactics concerning organization and vice versa, right? And I plan on making, of course, multiple videos on Iberian battles, specific units, arms and armor, this kind of stuff, and more, right? It's just for our Hellenistic era, let's say, warfare series, but there is naturally always a lot to dig, especially in such a, say, broad, big, large system like the Iberian one really was. That doesn't matter how relatively isolated, relatively, because of course there were Hellenic and Carthaginian colonists in the peninsula, and later, of course, the Romans influenced in part local warfare before the final conquest of the Iberian Peninsula that came, however, just in Augustan times, right? So this is a very complex picture, but it still shows essentially some important peculiarity of local warfare and or especially of political dynamics that, while pertaining mostly essentially to tribal realities, aside from something essentially more hybrid in civilization on the coast, was of course part of the broader continental European warfare that we have pointed out on different occasions, being after all quite similar, right, within itself. This is an important theoretical point to start from. I recently made multiple videos about Celtic warfare, and that's much broader statement, let's say, because of course we're talking about very different peoples as far as the geography is concerned, and I will not, of course, digress again of what does it mean actually to be a Celt on such a wide area. And the Iberian Peninsula is, as you know, in part Celticized as well. Well, we're looking at essentially, even for the Iberian element, the native one before essentially the Indo-European migrations, including the Lusitanians, in spite of the fact that, of course, there is a minimal level of uncertainty or at least some contradiction in the sources that notionistically say, well, these guys were Iberians, whatever. That's not that important, at least for the Lusitanians. It's fairly well established that they were a separate branch of the Indo-European peoples, right? They didn't have to do with the Celts even specifically, right? And even when we talk about Celtiberians, what does that mean in practice? I recently made a video, for example, on the Celtic metallurgic legacy in Romano-Germanic warfare, and you understand, of course, that while there were, of course, reasons for the Celts to have developed an impressive, say, armory on their own, there were influences from other areas, right? And Spain was definitely one in which the hybrid between, in fact, Iberian blades and the Latin ones would emerge into the better known Gladius Hispaniensis, and in that case also as a type of weapon that was eventually refined for the specific needs of the Roman army. I've always found Iberian warfare quite interesting exactly because of this sort of shaded cultural background. You have essentially the most Celticized elements in the north, then an Iberian south, and again something between is a hybrid plus these external Mediterranean influences. Iberian warfare didn't even stop like within the Iberian Peninsula, aside from those groups like the Vascones, etc., that were straddling, say, the Pyrenees. They were in part living in Gaul, etc. Iberian mercenaries were quite renowned, right, as this general sort of tribal and warlike populations of the European hinterland, and would become famous, especially for their equestrian skills. Think about the famous Cantabrian gallop, and were quite aggressive under somebody else's guidance as mercenaries, fundamentally, be hired even in Africa, and taking on successfully even the famed Berber cavalries, right, and beating a bit that myth that has been somehow forever perpetrated that, say, Western cavalry in general was, think about the Crusades, right, or even the same Reconquista. I actually made a video essentially to debunk this on especially the European mounts, right, would have seen a sort of cumbersome, heavy knight incapable of chasing the sort of the Eastern non-European, at least in this case, cavalries, and that were hopelessly faster and more agile, and the thing would always end in disaster. As a matter of fact, it's wrong. Not just because in Iberian warfare, of course, shows this. Well, there were lots of lighter horsemen as well, but in the same Iberian warfare, in the same Western warfare, the very heavier guys were able to reach and cut to pieces the lighter and allegedly more agile and faster horsemen. Right. This is a little digression, actually, to frame in a more interesting way. And in this case, the Spaniard potential, also in ancient times, right? And from our videos on the Reconquista, we have pointed out how it doesn't matter who comes to reign in these places. At the end of the day, local warfare remains largely unchanged, and specifically Iberian in nature. You can have actually lots of influences externally in many ways, especially in our medieval warfare series. We have dissected in Islamic times, arms and armor that we find in Spain, and being extremely similar to not just the Middle Eastern, but even the Central Asian ones at some point. Not so such a widespread way, but still meaningful enough through, in that case, the Muslim channel. But the sense that the North was, again, more primitive, warlike, but in tribal, and also with its limits and times of expansion, was habituated to launch these raids to the more developed areas of the south that could at times, at least in this case, it's the other way around. It's Rome that takes over, right? So it's not a fixed dynamic, but the idea that, again, somebody also needing to be more warlike, needing to spend that sort of aptness to arms that its more, primitive background would have provided him with, just to exploit some sort of weaker south, right, that could be richer but more politically fragmented. And so turning to the best target is actually quite actual also for the for this case, right? I've never heard much interest in, or speculation what would have happened to the Iberian Peninsula if and at that point you can't quite exclude any invader there, because if it hadn't been for the Romans, it would have been for the Carthaginians that were already there, and so nobody has seen the Celtic North, right, being capable of fundamentally hegemonize with a unitary rule these peoples. This is true for basically any other in central, say, in the tribal hinterland of Europe, right? There is no sign that things were, of course, they would have progressed surely towards a more politically cohesive reality. But the expansion of Rome was much sort of faster, and by a scale, right, of quality and development that wasn't leaving many other options. And again, if it hadn't been for the Romans, it would have been for someone else, in spite of the intrinsic limits outside of the Roman world, especially as far as the cooptation of the so-called allies was concerned. This is another story, right? It's actually very fascinating as far as Roman warfare in Iberia is also concerned, because, as you know, there is a long history from Scipio. We were talking about it, so the very beginning of Roman presence the other day in the video about the trials to the Scipiones and Scipio's Continentia, right, and the way he treated the Celtiberian nobility that had been captured, etc., to Sertorius, right, and the sort of, yes, Romanization of these peoples, but also the adoption from this rebel, Marian left in Spain, let's say, where things were settled differently in Rome, was adopting Celtic symbolism, right, the white fawn, other even Celtic dress, etc. So that's quite a thing that we will deal with in another video specifically. But I thought it to be relevant because literally from it took essentially more than 200 years for the Romans to finally subjugate the entire peninsula. And so this was in part due to the fact that the Romans were not too interested in excessive overseas expansion, at least as far as the lack of commitment from the declining, in fact, citizenry, peasantry, right, was entailed. Of course, when the Roman warlords took over, things were changing. That's where, in fact, Rome acquires a properly continental European dimension, consolidating on these vast stretches of the hinterland. But there is a coexistence and a hybrid that, as the saying Gladius Hispaniensis, what was called, shows, is actually quite deep and relevant. At some point we will make videos also on the various auxiliaries of various nationalities, including the Spanish one, right? So that can be quite instructive. So as we pointed out, Spain was inhabited by several peoples, right? And in spite of the, in fact, greater advancement of the Hellenic and the Punic colonies on the coasts, the Iberian hinterland displayed, broadly speaking, a rather homogeneous way of war, right? There is, again, this greater shade we will observe now between the north and the south, but again, this is not, different eras are not comparable, and anytime I make, because there is really, we'll see, there is something to say, of course, but every time I make these videos, and specifically in this case, you realize that wargamistic prejudices, as far as, these guys, I don't know, because one source says something at some point, and then we know nothing about that in the first place, and archaeology, after all, shows us, yes, that maybe that type of sort of shields, sword design, etc., but they fought in such a different way. They were a different category. They had a different people they would have to dissect and to characterize, because it was so different, say, from the Celts or somebody else. They were all fighting practically in the same way, right? This is one thing that one must get straight about, say, ancient warfare at some very consistent levels, right? And given that this wargamism and sort of cosplaying of different sort of factions, roots, whatever, you wave the flag of, you cannot, have the same acceptance, the same eager disposition to accept the
actual only difference that existed concretely in this world, the one between civilizations, and the one between fundamentally tribes, right? Look at the same Romans, right? Conceptually, the Roman legionnaire is not different from a Celtic or an Iberian warrior, but it is disciplined, trained, and led in very different ways from these peoples, right? And of course, if technological differences are macroscopically and not even remotely close to be the size of today, you can imagine in the Iron Age. So largely these military systems were comparable. It was fundamentally in sedentary Europe, heavy infantry against heavy infantry, right? Of course, other armed, say cavalry, and that's it basically. And really, say the matter would be settled mostly through this higher quality, right, in discipline, training, and all the sort of apparatus that could provide with that level of quality. When we look at the Iberian Peninsula, thus, we don't have to think that, say, the South was, it's like for the Celtic War, it wasn't a substantially different way of war between the Celts, say, that bordered the Hellenic colonies of the Mediterranean and those fighting, I don't know, in Belgica, etc. There were, however, some trends, some differences, some orientations that were crucial as far as also the factual conquest of the peninsula was concerned, right? The Romans, as the Carthaginians, had fundamentally occupied the coastline, and that's basically what throughout the 2nd century BC Rome is about, right? And it made a lot of sense because comparatively, you have just more resources, that you have walled cities, you have greater riches. Say it's also easier to a degree to operate from the sea, etc. And these hinterland peoples couldn't quite do much, right? Only when, of course, the Rome specifically had more resources to spend to reinject in the system with the Marian reforms, and what the Roman army had de facto come by itself to be, together primarily with Roman politics, Roman society. You have, we have this force, you have these guys from the hinterland that at the end of the day always try to harass us because they have not much of another way to go, right? Because they rely on loot, etc. And they're just unstable, will pass to full conquest of the system. And the conquest of Roman Spain, again, was quite tough, mostly because the Romans were not particularly committed to it up to a certain point, right? And Iberian warfare, and it's pretty obvious to say that it wasn't that much of a threat or a developmental system that one may think. But it's equally important to appreciate the sort of values, the ethos, the cultural background of these warriors. So in the south and the east of the peninsula, you have what we call the Iberians. The Iberians there is a great historiographical debate about this, but they were sort of the blood and soul of the peninsula, right, before the Celts invaded. It was essentially a non-Indo-European people of debated origin. And as we were just saying, they had their own substantial toughness, right? Here the idea there was a sort of tougher north compared to the south is true as far as the level, again, of harshness and primitiveness of northern warfare really was. But the Iberian South was also pretty warlike and also more, say, materially provided. Some of the toughest Iberian peoples were the Turdetani, right, who lived in this prosperous area which had once been the legendary kingdom of Tartessus, hence the name. And we can appreciate among these peoples a relative quietness and order that would favor the same Roman conquest. Essentially, the Romans, as you know, do not stop just to the coast. They have a minimal, of course, interference, but what is immediately the Iberian hinterland, where the Celtiberians were, yes, bordering the Roman territory too, especially in the northern part in the northeastern part of the peninsula. But immediately the Romans had to rather cope with these Iberian peoples that, having historically been more, say, and longer in contact with the Mediterranean civilizations, having served, say, in the Carthaginian army, etc., were sort of more influenced by that warfare, were less, let's say, reliant on that noisy sort of immediately aggressive and eventually spent charges, of the more typical, stereotypically at least, of the Celts, that also had fine order multiple times. I made a video about the Battle of the Alde River. So you definitely appreciate a higher level of awareness and of even military discipline, that, however, corresponds to states that see their future more easily within the Roman orbit, and so they're subsumed as auxiliaries of the Romans rather than something else, right? And don't get me wrong, as we have seen in Iberian warfare, the stereotype for these peoples, Iberians or Celtiberians, was to sort of avoid pitched battles, right, against the more drilled, disciplined armies of Carthage, of Rome, and when actually, of course, having to strike, because that's sort of a universal principle, concentrated forces, but being always quick to disengage in case of danger, and scattering across this very inhospitable Iberian plateau that was, just like would be again historically during the Reconquista, an enormous frontier, right? And it's difficult to describe this landscape, because first of all it is very varied, also climatologically, in terrain, but it is a tough one. You have all these various outposts scattered across this enormous plateaus with great thermic excursions from day to night. Some areas are semi-arid. They say that you must really know the territory in order to survive in there. And as we have explained in that video about the Roman cohortal system, and I will make something a bit more in depth about this, the actual development of the Roman cohorts was due to this, right? That as an army of occupation in Spain, because that was fundamentally during the 2nd century BC, so where that came to be in practice, and having already in fact invaded substantial parts of the hinterland, against these guerrilla tactics, you couldn't quite just concentrate that, 1,000-strong legion in a single place just to see the various supply lines and other territories, right, fundamentally around, taken over by the enemy. But you needed to split the legion into smaller parts that had to be also tactically autonomous, right? And so there you have the further homogenization of the Roman legionary. This was happening anyway for reasons that were primarily dictated in the Italian home, politically and socially, that we're all aware. We'll surely come back on this motive, but it's as if, you know, the military, the Roman 2nd century BC military crisis had been triggered by the Iberian theater, right? It's a sort of Roman Vietnam, except Rome won in the end. But you have definitely this enormous difficulties locally, because you really, in order to take out the enemy nest, you had to send troops and troops. And albeit it was never a matter of Roman preponderance in numbers, because fundamentally Rome conquered much larger peoples just than itself. It was not properly an endless pool of resources, as sometimes it's been described, right? Just to make to wink at sort of the barbarians in a way, inexplicably, and wrongly from just a moral and scientific point of view. But you gotta appreciate indeed how tough this Iberian warfare concretely was, right? Mostly the territory, right? It's like those guys, so I don't know, veterans that tell you, well, of course the Iraqi army, beginning of the 2000 was, an army, proper, but the territory was easier, and so we fundamentally took it out. Then you look at Afghanistan. Of course, the enemy sucked, because the Taliban are definitely not what you would consider a particularly qualitative enemy. But the environment is so tough that it complicates things that much. Of course, I'm simplifying. It's never the environment; it's always the enemy at the end of the day. But consider the times and the spaces. Considering we are in the first centuries BC, consider that again Rome was habituated now to just conquer pretty rich areas, right? That were confined to the coastal lines, mostly the Atlantic/Hellenistic world, and in countries like these where guerrilla was relentless, there was factually no way to concentrate power to stabilize the region, etc. At some point, you had to go kick ass, but you had to do it by getting your hands dirty and prepared to accept losses, like the ones that Rome suffered at many times. Think about the Viriatus revolt, etc. Again, it's always a matter of will, right, to win. If you don't have that, you're going to suffer defeat. When things start turning, right, because there is a specific reason, a specific motivation, etc., then victories do arrive, right? And Rome fundamentally controls for good all these wide as world-like territory. Several invasions had settled, as we observed, Celtic tribes in the Iberian Peninsula, especially in the north, any part also in the west. The Celtici, as they were called in Latin, were spreading as far as what is today southern Portugal. They were mixing, in fact, with the Saint Lusitanians, we'll explain now. And you have this quite interesting hybrid, which is technically what also the Gladius Hispaniensis fundamentally is about, of civilization of the Celts by the Turdetanian neighbors, right? The sort of sharing of mutual metallurgical skills, and also a lot of warfare, by the way, because we have seen what this was about. Continuous raiding, right? In a way that was even institutionalized, right? Different peoples, like, I don't know, the Romans, the Greeks, etc., were habituated to fight big pitched battles, to have a sense of, definitive settlement, at least in this major encounters and so on. These populations were just habitually involved into raiding warfare with some parties, bands, etc., and they had ritualized what was factually a need, right, to do so. It's not that, again, historically, as we've made really lots of videos about, this was not the norm everywhere, right, as it had been in Italy up to a couple of centuries before. That in part, right, the same Roman expansion was the natural evolution, as it was true, in fact, for the Celtic world, for the Germanic one, etc. And all the values of these populations revolved around this, right? There is a debate regarding the aforementioned contact, right, of Celtic and Iberian
weaponry, because scholars fundamentally suggest that that sort of more, what was called the Hispanic sword, was more of an Iberian thing than a Celtic one. It's debatable, but it's also fundamentally correct, right? If you look especially through the Roman lens at the first finds of gladius, the earliest ones, well, you realize they looked much more like the Latin swords, and even when it was something produced, right, thanks to the Celtiberian smiths unitly, then something more curved, right, as sometimes even in different sort of artistic reproductions you find the gladius, the Roman gladius hispaniensis, mostly with that sort of leaf-shaped blade, right? But there is a very slight curving in that regard, but fundamentally this sword is not even that different from the later spada, right? And there is all a digression here to make regarding how documented we are, say, on infantry weapons, given that they were prevalent in the Roman army compared to the cavalry ones, because we know that even the small units of Roman citizen cavalry presumably used something more similar to what would be the spada, like later on, than, say, the evolution that the gladius has in the infantry, that in the early empire becomes something relatively shorter and more trusting, even though it was perfectly fine just for chopping heads and limbs, that it was like a pleasure. But this is especially true of the earlier weapons, right? So I made a video about the gladius hispaniensis already, but we will come back on this because it's not even just that simple as a few statements can settle. Oh, well, the gladius was just a dagger for thrusting. No, right? And in any case, documentation is quite a complex thing, because, yeah, we can have those finds, but what did really a 2nd century BC Roman army in Spain look like? Right, it's a completely different story. And even what did a Celtiberian army, right, of the same period look like? Right. And don't get me wrong, as you see even from the pictures here, there is plenty of good documentation. Like, the Iberian Peninsula was not particularly backwards compared to to Europe as a whole, right? Meaning that these peoples were similar, just like Gaul, for example, to this phase of proto-urbanization, of important development of metallurgy, local resources, trade, mining, right? That was all connected in wealth, in metallurgic capacities, etc. In the central Meseta, the Celts and the Iberians merged to form what are, at least by someone, considered like the 4 Celtiberian tribes that are to be considered likely the strongest forces in Spain, all right, individually. It's not clear whether the tribes of the Western Highlands, the Lusitanians, the Cantabrians, the Asturians, and the Vascones and others were, say, what degree of mix they were in this regard. That's something substantially complex that I don't want to digress on here. Just, it's important to observe how the, let's say, the mix, like very often in history, like the mix between the traditional and the modern, between the primitive and the developed, provides with sort of the best results on a given time. These were the populations that would give more problems to the Romans, right? So we're talking about moral load and this balance between, say, availability of resources and sort of warlikeness that did vary significantly within, say, in in latitude in Spain, but that was not directly proportional in this regard. There is also, like, the ancient authors are not necessarily that reliable. For example, Diodorus Siculus was certain about the Lusitanians being Iberians, while today, again, as we said before, they are considered Indo-European without too much of a problem. The Celtiberians were mostly mountain tribes. They were thus rough, hardy, and simple people, right? They regularly practiced with weapons, right? And as Strabo says, leading a life of brigandage and uninterrupted warfare. This is important because you get where they were so, resistant and resilient against Roman expansionism. The same Scipio didn't consider them particularly much. He said we're great guerrilla fighters, but when it came to open ground engagements, of course, they would essentially melt away. But again, conquering the Iberian hinterland was quite of a challenge, and these guys were quite rooted within the territory. Think about the siege of Numantia, and like how much before getting to it the Romans had to struggle in order to avoid encirclements and being cut, having their supplies lines cut, etc. And consistent Roman forces that were again unmotivated and just captured literally by the consuls in the Italian hinterland, where they had become too poor to even having anything right to serve, right? But they needed, the Republic at that point needed manpower. Were sent in this carnage, and there are sort of very black legends about the Iberians making these ambushes, raids, incursions at night, and never resting, right? There is a ludicrous anecdote about some Iberian auxiliaries in the Roman army that were shocked by the fact that, say, the Romans had a resting time aside from sleep, because apparently these troops were habituated just to be always on the move, fighting, etc. Naturally, it's an exaggeration. They surely knew how to dose their time, etc. But also their warfare was substantially different from the one of the Romans. And after all, if they were there as auxiliaries, it's because they were used for that third-tier job, right? That was paving the way to the legions, and that were the ones that had to engage the enemy when this was sufficiently concentrated and storming strongholds, etc. Whereas, again, the auxiliaries were mostly into skirmishing, raids, ambushing, screening, exploring, and of course fighting, because in those circumstances, because that's what essentially Iberian warfare was about, right? And we'll see how, of course, there were pitched battles, or at least something approximating that large-scale engagements in open field in Spain as well. But they were definitely less frequent, and also fought in substantially different ways than you would have seen, right? I don't know, the Romans or the Macedonians fighting. It's also worth to remind in general that it was de facto impracticable to even try to unite the Iberian tribes altogether. There were, of course, alliances of two or of more, but aside from the mercenaries, or better, these war bands that would in any case join, because we're politically tied clientelly. There was an aristocracy that married into each other, that fostered each other's kids to rise as, as warriors. There were these
brotherhoods of devotees engaging into the famous devotio to die before his leader would, and that, of course, enlarged significantly the numbers of the tribe's strength. Again, not differently from what you would have seen, I don't know, among the Celts, the Germans, the etc. This helped, of course, creating more powerful unions, but there is no sign historically of a proclivity or a political possibility to unite as a single group, right? At least when the Romans invaded Gaul at some point, Vercingetorix has the capacity to bring together great chunks of Gaul, but when it was too late and the country had been already violated by the Germans, by the Romans, and it was evidently ready for Romanization and more. Spain was a different affair, right? The lack of also of ethnic cohesion, the difference in landscapes, the enormous extension of the peninsula, the fact that it was practically isolated, because yes, you had the Romans that brought there, like the Carthaginians had a significant development, but from one side you have the Atlantic, then you have in the north the Pyrenees, and in the south the Gibraltar Strait, and not particularly pressuring in the sense of stimulating peoples that would bring to a need of coalition or a long-term, historical process of political compaction. None of this, right? So the Romans took over a system that didn't have quite of a chance whenever Rome was focused in the conquest to survive the latter, right? So even when you look at Viriatus, other leaders that were quite effective as far as their personal fortune was concerned, eventually losing anyway, because they didn't have much of a long life, habitually just in that business. It's because of essentially a weak Roman response, not because there was a potential now to unite. These are things that came mostly by times in which, of course, a completely different idea of politics and nationhood was there. So these guys were almost every country in Europe, whenever the Romans went, has its own hero or heroine of, a resistance against Roman conquest. But concretely, it was more. It is more realistic to frame this as a sort of civil war between the same Iberians, right? Those who were accepted fundamentally to be within Rome, with all the autonomies, the elite co-option, etc., or just finding themselves out there and being pressured by these other actual locals who were calling in the Romans and opening the way through the hinterland, right? So it is like this, and as I was saying before, not just think that these guys were really similar, like to other peoples, and in part to the same Italic legionnaire, but they, throughout the Roman conquest, kept fighting against large numbers of their own kin, right? This is characteristic of the Roman or any other conquest for that matter, all right? Celtiberians, being the most prized warriors in the Iberian Peninsula, were as such more inclined as well to serve as mercenaries, because they would get good pays, right? And this is true not just for peoples like Carthage that notoriously use these troops, or the same Rome, but the same Iberians. For example, the Turdetani hired at some point 10,000 Celtiberians by themselves. It is worth appreciating that, of course, there were lots of Iberian mercenaries proper, right, as well, and that they were a good sort of, as we've seen, discreet, obedient force that, albeit not as spectacular like the Celtiberians in their greater animosity and sort of willing to stand their ground to the death, operated right at very important strategic levels, right, garrisoning local fortresses for Rome, providing the bulk of this, again, mostly lancers, right, as this is the typical warrior after all, a guy with a lance slash, say, a spear slash javelin, practically a shield. If they were sort of affluent, some sort of metal armor, right, and being able to provide consistent forces, right, the local nobility having the capacity of providing with these guys, even just as a levy, right, and to send to the Romans in exchange of something else. One tribal alliance in the Iberian Peninsula at a point was said to be able to field over 100,000 men, which is naturally impossible, right? Nothing more than 50,000 could have been possible, right? And definitely this was not the norm in the Iberian Peninsula, as practically nowhere else. What these numbers mean, aside from the very round 100,000, of course, is the fact that the Iberian hinterland was fairly populated. These, say, different tribes would join in an alliance of some sort, and so they could altogether boast, considering their number of men, sort of this military force that, however, could not quite literally be mobilized all at the same time and or handled concretely and realistically, if not at a devastating and surely detrimental political cost, right? Because, again, we're not talking really about states here. There isn't properly the surplus capacity to field large forces for a prolonged amount of time without raiding, plundering, so being obliged to also expose themselves, or otherwise coming back wherever they had come from, and disperse as such. This is something we've seen often for all the fringe areas, like we've seen it for, I don't know, the Welsh, the English conquest of Wales back in the Middle Ages. It's a broader strategic concept, and it applies, in fact, in these cases of in which you realize your own strategic inferiority fundamentally, but in order to be more effective, you're ready to mobilize quicker to send, say, even a modest contingent, but from very far away, say the far north of Spain. It was particularly characterized, as we've seen, in that kind of raiding warfare, to say, fighting against the Romans in the center, in the south of the peninsula, and then when it was over, just coming back home, and of course Rome taking centuries to arrive up to the north, but being aware, of course, that temporary force joining could be a concrete problem. But even in here, it's not much a matter of numbers. It's knowing the terrain, it's fighting against demoralized enemies that really do not want to be on that in that faraway frontier, ambushing them, knowing well the terrain characteristics, and creating problems, in fact, mostly of this kind, and admitting that facing Rome in open ground was sort of a risk that they were not that willing to take. So if we were to make a more realistic assessment of the average, say, or the largest forces that were ever actually fielded by, for example, the Celtiberians, well, we know that the latter in 801 BC had 35,000 men, right? This was surely a larger number than their usual armies, and again, it's just a number of an ancient source, so we should have seen, what these 35,000, what they are, right? An entire fighting unit, and if so, to which quality and which segmentation internally, etc. But it's obvious that this is an acceptable number when you say, well, how much could these people feel when they wanted to engage in a major showdown? Well, yeah, that's accurate, likely. In Dibilis, a chieftain of the Iberian Ilergetes, in 205 BC, raised 34,000 from his own people, the Ausitani, and other groups, which shows you more or less, again, the capacity of what was essentially a normal army. What is important here, also in comparison to other peoples, is that, as we were saying before, there weren't many differences in the even in the scale of armies could be fielded, right? It's not that really, say, less developed cultures could just proportionally field smaller armies, and if they didn't, by the way, this means that they were so necessarily, say, at the same level of other groups. Of course, they could, right, and they would. And the reason why this was less frequent is, again, simple political and strategic vision, right? If there was an enemy that was stronger in open field, and it's obvious that you wouldn't want to take him in fact in the open, and you would prefer, especially given this sort of background, to wear him out, right? Trying to split him, to harass him, etc. That is not really an advantage, right? It stems from the fact that, of course, the single most convenient thing to do, in principle, it is to, if you're really strong, you must concentrate forces and overwhelm everything that you have in front, right? But of course, contingencies can make it different. It still doesn't erase that contingencies are telling that if you had the strength to face these guys in open field, you would have done it, right? And it's not like a smart trick to win, say, in absolute terms, right? Also because war is subordinated to politics. It's just a way to try to make the enemy see that it's not that worth it anyway, but also still being a disadvantage, because the enemy can overwhelm you in that way too, especially by concentrating force. There is a balance odd, but if you are the one who backs down and that leaves the initiative to the enemy, you know you are the weakest side at the moment, and you expect to gain an advantage in the process, but still the starting point is an advantage of the enemy. Of the aforementioned troops of Indibilis, we know that 4,000 were cavalry. So 4,000 cavalry, 30,000 infantry. This is interesting because, albeit Iberian warfare was famous for the equestrian skills of these peoples, still overwhelmingly their armies were on foot, right? It is true that these warriors would have been quite apt to also mount a horse, etc. But between that sort of raiding experience with some, in cattle raiding, etc., and having an actually cohesive army that can mount and, can field this large, compact, effective, and sort of even heavy type of cavalry, well, it's a bit of a different thing, right? At least these cavalry forces could be found evidently on a regular basis, but even about their quality, we don't think that there was this dramatic collective training, and so not even much this great of an effectiveness. The same context, like if you place more emphasis on skirmishing, it's because you can't quite depending on your enemy always, not in absolute terms, because otherwise you would do. You're just saying that you're not strong enough as him, right? And again, otherwise you would simply attack him. Remember that light and heavy are relative concepts, right? That's why, I don't know, skirmishers would also take on each other, because of course they were not designed to fight against heavier types of cavalry. They were still provided with that shock capacity that cavalry fundamentally only has, right? And so, unless you want to just skirmish from the distance, and that's propedeutic, by the way, just to a softening up of the enemy lines, and so smashing at a certain point. Well, you have to recognize that you you may have a real disadvantage against. You can have all this cavalry, but not being that qualitative, particularly. Also, because shock charges are something that requires a very specific alignment, training, etc. So the skirmisher, just by default, doesn't quite do that, right? And he's somehow spent himself at the end of all his skirmishing. In the 1st century BC, the Lusitanians gave the Roman rebel Sertorius 4,000 infantry and 700 cavalry, right? That just for pointing out the proportion. It's not even that absolute few, right? It's more or less what the enemy would have, by the way, given that the Romans by that point had reduced to the minimum their own citizen cavalry, and they mostly used this other population's horsemen, right? Think about in the Numantine War, the Numidian forces that were sent from Africa to support Rome, right? And that later, as with Jugurtha, right, you would have the same Numidian wars in part of the recognition, the experience, the sort of understanding that these service had of the Roman political, even before then, the military machine. So Rome at this point could really field also equal, sort of similar types of troops from other regions, especially as far as this light sort of skirmishing cavalry was concerned. So this 12-15% of cavalry we've just seen seem to have been typical proportions for Iberian armies. There is no doubt that, of course, it was a heavier elite cavalry, could be quite good, especially in terms of individual training, and that cavalry recruitment was, a task, of course, assigned to the tribal nobility. That was the one chosen in times of war, of course, to gather forces far and wide, and being, in fact, more like the elite, right, up in the hierarchy, would have longer range contacts, and they could call with other noblemen, other people from more far away than the sort of levy militiamen that couldn't quite come from too far away and would have made it even relatively impracticable. But as we've seen, infantry contingents were there, nevertheless, and so you wanna appreciate how complex, after all, this system really was, and the coordination, the sort of, again, in this chronic political fragmentation, how, of course, still people would join from everywhere, depending on their ambitions and dreams. The tribal nobility provided also the commander's bodyguards that were sworn, again, not to survive their master, but to die with him as a sacrifice if he failed. The Romans knew this practice as the devotio, and we still haven't made a video about this, because somebody, if you look at the basic explanation, this is that the devotio entailed fundamentally it could mean different things technically, but at least the one of the general that sacrifices himself in the Roman sagas to save the army, etc., says that basically the guy would sacrifice himself, basically, to allow his own men to win, so giving something in exchange. And to the deities of hell that were Teuctonic, they were not the ones of the Uranian victory, but the sense, and this is true even especially also for the war bands, and so the system that we see here even at higher level, was that the commander, say in the Roman case, it's when everything was lost, and he said, okay, well, I sacrificed myself as a hope that my sacrifice would be enough to satiate. I will take on me all the negativity, like all the damnation, all the failure, but I will let the others to gain victory if they can, right? And so there were implications because the enemy, say the general would want to take down as many enemies as a tribute to the deities of hell, and so this would create panic, because it's as if the deities of hell were unleashed on that battlefield as well, and they were, say, rising to prevent the Uranian victory on their side. In the sense of the war bands, the concept is slightly different. You see, this could have worked even for these Spanish commanders. Like if they individually failed, they could make a devotio themselves. But the sense for the retinues, and this was true also for the Romans in the Roman devotio, and we've seen it in the Germanic comitatus, etc., was that by recognizing the superiority of your leader, that you had still to somehow be able to reach to imitate, at also the cost of your life. That was the point, because it's not that these people would simply let themselves be killed, right? They were fighting anyways, so they were giving their their best. They would prefer, in fact, to die, right, hoping that this guy that they really thought to be a medium of the divinity would save their souls through victory. In other words, we'll see this soon, and also for modern warfare, the sacrifice of the followers was seen as an act of ultimate faith, right? The Roman used fides to describe, of course, also these practices in the Iberian Peninsula, in the commander to use them just as an extension of themselves. Remember that these war bands, and generally speaking, all these hierarchical relations were based on the concept that the chieftain was superior, that had a connection with the divinity, and to whom these people had to devote themselves, right? So, in other words, this leader, I made a video on sacred royalty, the same Sol Invictus, etc., had to lead the army to victory. It would transfigure himself, and so the world, hopefully, and primarily these guys that had contributed to his victory, into heaven. And that's the reason why they would, at that point, sacrifice themselves, for which, if they did not die right before before the commander was killed, which naturally they weren't looking forward to, because they were fully invested, especially the nobility in this case, in the cause, they would de facto not transfigure. And so this was a great, in fact, act of faith, not just towards the chieftain as a mortal, but through his transfiguring capacities as a conquering hero. Now, the desperation of these means is mirrored by Plutarch's dryly remark that a few Spanish commanders had large retinues as a result of the devotio, right? This is not technically a result of the devotio per se. it's mostly just like a part of the same issue, because every warrior, more or less, in Europe would make that kind of oath, right? The Roman legionaries did the same. It was a quite complex, again, a system of beliefs regarding the value of the insignia, what these were in conjunction with the consul as imperator, etc. So it's I made lots of videos about this, but we will keep talking about it because it's a very fascinating aspect. There is an old video about the official religion of the Roman army in the early empire that in part talks about this. The problem here is that politically and socially wasn't too much cohesion, right? As we observed before, that there wasn't like an hegemonic power here involved could say absorb all these forces, providing them with adequate discipline and maintaining cohesion, etc. Everything was just extremely fluid. These noble houses were constantly competing with one another. Alliances were formed as much as they were broken. This is the typical tribal context and background. Here Plutarch doesn't give us a terms of comparison, like yes, these Iberian commanders didn't have particularly large retinues, but to whom, right? Which people, such? Is it just making the morals, or about this say shortcoming, or was there something more to it? We do not know, but if the devotio was there, naturally we assume that it was pretty much similar to the universal one that existed conceptually among everyone. It's possible that the Iberians, exactly in virtue of this scarce cohesion, had overdeveloped it ideologically, because trying to make up, right, for that lack of glue, right? Now, looking a bit at the even the tactical segmentation of the Iberian forces, there were essentially two types of infantry. We've seen it also in the other video. Javelin skirmishers, called caetrati, and the heavier scutari. And you understand that these are Latin terms. We get them from Roman historiography, and of course refer to the shield these guys were using, the caetra and the scutum, right? There are, again, the scutum is a pretty standard term. It's just like you say gladius. It just means sword, right? That like, but yes, there was a similarity, as we have explained also in the video about Celtic warfare and other sort of ones about why the Romans, for example, never really adopted, or anybody else other than the Hellenic motherland, politic tactics, etc. Again, Europeans fought as sedentaries practically in the same way. A guy with a shield, pretty large in this case for heavy infantry, just like the again the Roman, the Celtic one, a sword, or a dagger, and a spear slash javelins, couple of javelins, and some armor depending on the wealth of the guy, and that's it, right? There isn't much of a conceptual difference between these guys and an Italian legionnaire, right? The scutari were the majority type of troops, as it was normal, because you don't have anywhere like a majority of troops being skirmishers in sedentary Europe, right? You have it among, I don't know, the Numidian cavalry, right? And we have seen that even though the Iberians had pretty good skirmishers, still the prevalence was the heavies, right? This was really normal, so it's a typical segmentation. Otherwise, 1/3 of Indibilis' army was made up by caetrati, though, and this is a pretty high proportion, nevertheless, which was also probably typical. And the reason why this was the case wasn't
necessarily the fact that these guys couldn't fight as heavy infantry if needed. Of course, this reflected mostly the fact that they couldn't afford a heavier equipment. But there is also a functional problem, that is to say, if you are carrying out guerrilla mostly, and that's your main strategy, well, you're also trying to operate in ways that fit that. So you will try to be more agile and lighter and sort of more designed for this hit and run tactics. You save something with that, right? And the same reason why you're fighting like that. Likely you don't have much else to fight with, right? And this shows you also, after all, the degree of primitiveness of a substantial part of the Iberian hinterland, especially the northern one. The Lusitanian infantry were all caetrati by name, but this actually could be misleading because, of course, we can imagine most of them being heavily equipped. Also, doesn't necessarily mean that by having a caetra you're just a lighter infantryman, right? We understand that in this far west, fundamentally the peninsula, things are a bit rougher, but we know, of course, that Lusitanian elites also had their heavies, etc. Just say here there could be a particular local style that would spread the smaller shield more than the heavier one. For some reason we can't quite discern, and I don't think it is really a thing. Like, we are told historically, but doesn't mean that concretely, right, made the Lusitanians differ in ways of war. I don't think so, as a matter of fact, from the rest of the Iberians. And still, the majority of Lusitanian armies were surely heavy infantry, right? Skirmishers included slingers. We do not see too many archers, telling the truth, as arrowheads have been found, but not in particular quantity. Also, historiographically, we do not get mention of Iberian archery. This doesn't mean that it wasn't there. Again, we are looking at, after all, very scarce information overall on these peoples. There are not major, like the Greeks, the Romans, etc. It's also an information which, unless you have a particularly, archery, developed people, like, I don't know, the steppes one, or etc., it's kind of pointless to just say that it existed, because we know that archery, of course, existed everywhere. Surely didn't lack in the Iberian Peninsula. But it is possible that it was just less developed than the sling in general used, and the reasons are a bit difficult to find. Right? It's possible that, well, again, we shouldn't fall in the trap of thinking that necessarily was that underdeveloped, right? But it's likely that whenever you see more armor around, and these sort of differences in height, also this sort of hill forts and sieges, etc., you realize that archery was there, but that you can exploit better the smashing power of a sling and of stones in general, with a relatively more adaptable practice, right? The idea is that Iberian warfare is so rough that even archery doesn't find that elegant setting to be more used to be practiced, even to be trained. Of course, the Iberian nobility used the bow for hunting, so they perfectly knew how to use it also in combat. Just we do not find, incidentally, too much evidence of archery in Iberian warfare. Actually, say documentary sources are pretty silent about that. Silius Italicus is an early imperial source, claims that Saguntum, an Hellenic-influenced Iberian town that, as you know, was also the
essentially the casus belli for the Second Punic War, used catapults when in fact attacked by Hannibal. Silius calls the engines employed by the defenders as Phocian, intending that they came from Massalia, right? The Phocian Hellenic colony, right? So not engines from, Asia Minor, but in any case, these torsion catapults, we can think of them were pretty much everywhere by that point. I mean, including the Carthaginian army. If it wasn't for the fact that Hannibal didn't make quite a intensive use of these engines for different reasons. It's not that he wouldn't know how to use them, but say siege warfare wasn't much of his thing, as opposed to open field engagements. It's worth mentioning that when the Romans conquered Carthago Nova, it's not that far from Saguntum after all, from the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War, they found an enormous arsenal of these siege engines. And I made multiple videos on this already, but we'll have to come back on it, because also the role of artillery in ancient warfare gets a bit often misunderstood in terms of scopes and use. In this case, Saguntum is like a hybrid between, again, a Iberian town and an Hellenic polis of some sort. It's a bit like Emporion. It was even more Hellenic actually in nature. You have this Massilian influence, etc. There were this sort of Hellenic markets on the coast. And so it's obvious that for the defense of a significant fortification, you would have these engines of different type, not just necessarily torsion catapults, but right, they could be used. And this is just to say that it's not this special thing, right? Siege warfare was fundamentally about that, and this was a civilized enough, or civilly influenced enough area to have that. Sure, there is not much mention of catapults in the Iberian hinterland for that matter, and it would have been just a waste of money in a sense, meaning that those are not, it's much less urbanized reality. You have at best this hill forts, so you do not need a sophisticated torsion catapult that requires very specific material, such as animal tendons treated in a certain way, Asian woman hair, really. And so there are other ways to storm a fortress of that kind, either by blockading it or actually assaulting it, etc. And that's always an option. Alright, the siege of these larger centers is another story. It's more complex, and you need to take out these sort of artillery to avoid losses. So there is a lot of artillery, counter-artillery in siege warfare, but that's in fact something that normally these bigger cities would have in store materially just for the Athenians, but it wasn't about this really, that the matter was settled, where you had to have supplies, defenders, and other, say, contingent factors that, of course, depended on the circumstance, the terrain, the nature of the places, and so on. And we will hopefully look at all these things in some depth whenever we get, let's say, the chance to talk more. But we didn't talk so much about the Punic War, but the Punic Wars in general. But the less we have done now, the more we will do hopefully in the future. And I really plan to cover everything in great depth, so that we understand, we give a full picture of the world. This is what Schwerpunkt fundamentally is about. At times you find this very sparsely themed videos. But at the end of the day, they're all part of a bigger net that is meant to thicken its mail, so that you eventually get the full tapestry of the entire story. And so that's what we're gradually doing. So today, another brick added specifically for Iberian warfare that we will see in more depth, hopefully another time. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.